The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of my Victorian dining room, casting delicate shadows across the mahogany table that had served my family for 4 generations. At 64, I still took pride in maintaining the traditions of the Whitaker household, setting out the finest china for what I believed would be a simple visit from Grace Chen. The Whitaker estate had stood on this hill overlooking the valley for 140 years, built by my great-grandfather with lumber money during the Reconstruction era. The house itself was a testament to enduring craftsmanship, high ceilings, hand-carved moldings, and windows that had witnessed the passage of countless seasons. Most importantly, it was protected by a family trust established during the Great Depression, a fact that would prove more significant than I could have imagined. Grace had called that morning, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Mrs.
Whitaker, could we talk? Just the two of us?" Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but I pushed the feeling aside. Grace was my daughter-in-law Isabella's older sister, and while we'd always been cordial, we weren't particularly close. I smoothed my hands over the cream-colored linen tablecloth, the same one I'd used for family gatherings for 30 years. The house felt too quiet with just me rattling around in it lately. Marcus, my husband of 42 years, had been distant for months, always finding excuses to work late or disappear into his study, and Connor, our 35-year-old son, was so wrapped up in his marriage to Isabella that his visits had become perfunctory at best. The doorbell chimed, and I opened it to find Grace standing on my front steps, clutching her purse like a shield. She looked pale, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged around her eyes as if she'd been crying. "Mrs. Whitaker, thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, dear. Come in." I led her to the dining room, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she set down her purse. "I made your favorite cucumber sandwiches and that lemon cake you complimented last Easter." She managed a weak smile, but didn't touch the food I'd carefully arranged. Instead, she stared at her folded hands, her knuckles white with tension. "Grace, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She looked up then, and I saw something in her dark eyes that made my blood run cold. Pain, guilt, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of love that I would later understand was directed toward my son. "Mrs. Whitaker, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it without destroying everything," Grace began, her voice shaking. My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice steady. "Whatever it is, we can work through it together." Grace let out a shaky breath, tears pooling in her eyes. "It's about Isabella and Marcus. They're having an affair." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain still, my hands folded calmly in my lap. "Are you certain?" Grace nodded miserably. "I saw them together at the Grandview Hotel downtown, the one near Marcus's office. They were holding hands, kissing, acting like lovers. I've known for weeks, but I didn't know how to tell you." I felt something inside me crack, like ice breaking on a frozen pond, but my voice remained steady. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 8 months," Grace whispered. "Maybe longer. I confronted Isabella about it, and she didn't even try to deny it. She just laughed and said it wasn't any of my business. But Mrs. Whitaker, the things she said about you..." Her voice broke completely. "What things?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "She said you were old and boring, that Marcus deserved better. She said once the divorce was final, she'd make sure you got as little as possible. She's been planning this, Mrs. Whitaker, the whole thing. She married Connor to get close to the family, to the money. She's been working on Marcus for months, using her nursing background to understand his medications, his stress levels, manipulating his emotions. The room spun around me, but I gripped the edge of the table and held on. 42 years of marriage, a son I'd raised with love and dedication, a daughter-in-law I'd welcomed with open arms, all of it crumbling because of greed and calculated manipulation. "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. Grace reached across the table and grasped my hand. "Because it's wrong. Because you've been nothing but kind to our family, and you don't deserve this. Because Connor doesn't deserve to be married to someone who's capable of this level of deception." She paused, wiping her eyes with her free hand. "And because I love him, Mrs. Whitaker, I've loved Connor for years, long before Isabella came into the picture. I can't stand watching her destroy everything good in this family." The confession hung in the air between us, adding another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. I studied Grace's face, seeing the genuine anguish there, the moral struggle that had brought her to my door. "Does Connor know?" I asked. "No. And I don't know if I should tell him. It would destroy him." I pulled my hand free and stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden Marcus and I had planted together in our early years. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals bright against the green foliage. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, but underneath, the roots were rotting. "What will you do?" Grace asked behind me. I turned back to her, and something had shifted inside me. The initial shock was giving way to something cooler, more calculating. I'd spent my entire adult life taking care of others, smoothing over problems, keeping the peace, but this wasn't something that could be smoothed over. "Nothing," I said calmly. Grace's eyes widened. "Nothing. I'm going to pretend I never heard this conversation. I'm going to smile and play the devoted wife and mother, and I'm going to let them think they're winning." I sat back down and poured myself a cup of tea with steady hands. "But first, I'm going to learn everything I can about what they're planning." Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own home. I installed a small recording device in Marcus's study, hidden behind a picture frame. I photographed documents left carelessly on his desk. I noted every phone call, every late evening, every change in his routine. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Isabella hadn't just seduced my husband. She'd systematically researched our family's financial situation using public records and her access to our home. She knew about the trust fund, the investment accounts, even the insurance policies. She'd been planning this takeover for nearly a year. Marcus, meanwhile, was going through what could only be described as a pathetic midlife crisis. At 66, he was struggling with health issues, business stress, and what his doctor had diagnosed as mild depression. Isabella Seni, with her nursing background, had positioned herself as his confidant and healer, gradually replacing me in his emotional life. The cruelest part was watching him try to justify his betrayal to himself. In his recorded conversations with Isabella, I heard him rationalize that I would be better off without him, that our marriage had become more of a friendship anyway. He was rewriting our entire history to make his betrayal feel noble. But I also heard something else in those recordings, uncertainty. Despite his infatuation with Isabella, Marcus still felt guilty. He loved our son, respected our family history, and part of him knew what he was doing was wrong. That guilt would be my weapon. Victoria Sterling's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. At 45, Victoria had built a reputation as one of the best divorce attorneys in the state, specializing in complex asset division and high-conflict cases. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said after I'd explained my situation, "I have to ask why you haven't confronted your husband directly about the affair." I clasped my hands in my lap, choosing my words carefully. "Because I want to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions. This house, our assets, our family legacy, I need to know where I stand legally." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Let's start with the basics. How are your assets currently titled? For the next hour, we went through everything the house purchased 90 years ago with money from my family's timber business, the investment accounts accumulated over decades of careful saving, the small manufacturing company Marcus had inherited from his father. Most importantly, we examined the family trust that had been established by my great-grandfather in 1934. "This is fascinating," Victoria said, studying the trust documents I'd brought. "Your great-grandfather was quite forward-thinking. This trust has some very specific provisions about inheritance and divorce." "What kind of provisions?" Victoria read from the document. "The house and primary assets can never be sold or transferred to anyone outside your direct bloodline. Even if you divorce, your husband would have no claim to these properties. And there's a clause here about infidelity that's quite unusual for trusts established in that era." My pulse quickened. "What does it say?" "In the event that a marriage is dissolved due to adultery on the part of the spouse, the innocent party retains all rights to trust properties, and the offending party forfeits any claim to assets derived from or connected to said trust." Victoria looked up at me. "This was added in 1936, apparently after your great-grandfather's own son went through a messy divorce." I sat back in my chair, feeling something like hope stir in my chest for the first time in weeks. "So, if I can prove Marcus's affair, you would retain not just the house, but several other properties and investments that are connected to the trust. Properties that your husband currently believes he has a stake in." Victoria shook her head. "From what you've told me, it sounds like he's operating under the assumption that you'd be entitled to half of everything in a standard divorce proceeding. He has no idea about the trust's protections. What do I need to prove adultery legally?" "Documentation, photographs, witness testimony, or admission of guilt. The standard is clear and convincing evidence, which is higher than most civil cases but lower than criminal court." Victoria leaned forward. "But here's the crucial part. The adultery clause only applies if the innocent spouse files for divorce. If your husband files first and claims irreconcilable differences, it becomes much harder to invoke these protections." "Then I need him to file," I said. "And I need him to believe he's getting everything he wants." That Sunday, Isabella arrived for our usual family dinner wearing a new designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She swept into my kitchen with theatrical warmth, embracing me with what I now recognized as calculated affection. "Evelyn, you look wonderful," she gushed. "I love what you've done with the flowers on the table." I returned her hug, noting the expensive perfume that clung to her skin, the same scent I'd detected on Marcus's shirts lately. "Thank you, dear. Connor should be here shortly. Would you like some wine while we wait?" "That would be lovely." She settled herself at the kitchen island, crossing her legs elegantly. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a little chat. Just us girls." My hands remained steady as I poured the wine, though my heart began to race. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Isabella took a delicate sip and leaned forward conspiratorially. "I'm worried about you, Evelyn, about you and Marcus." The audacity of it nearly took my breath away. Here she was, the architect of my marriage's destruction, pretending to be concerned. "Oh, why would you be worried?" "Well, you two seem so distant lately. At family gatherings, there's this tension." She placed her manicured hand over mine in a gesture of false sympathy. "Marriage can be so challenging after so many years. The spark just fades sometimes." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words. "You know, you might be right. We have been going through a rough patch." Isabella's eyes lit up with satisfaction that she tried to disguise as concern. "Have you considered counseling? Or maybe it's time to think about what would make you both happier in the long run." "You think we should divorce?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "I'm not saying that." She backtracked quickly, but I could see the excitement beneath her concerned facade. I just think life is too short to stay in a marriage that isn't fulfilling. You deserve to be happy. Evelyn, you deserve someone who appreciates you." The irony was suffocating. "That's very thoughtful of you to say." "I care about this family," she continued, her voice taking on practiced sincerity. "Connor would want both his parents to be happy, even if that means being apart. And honestly, you're still such an attractive woman. I'm sure there are plenty of men who would be thrilled to have someone like you." When Connor arrived, the dynamic shifted immediately. Isabella transformed into the devoted wife, hanging on his every word, touching his arm constantly, laughing at his jokes with exaggerated delight. But I noticed how her eyes would drift to the doorway whenever Marcus's car pulled into the driveway. Marcus entered the dining room 20 minutes late, claiming he'd been detained at the office. Isabella's cheeks flushed pink when he kissed my cheek in greeting, and I watched as their eyes met for just a moment too long across the table. After dinner, while Connor and I cleared the dishes, Isabella and Marcus remained at the table, their conversation low and intimate. I strained to catch fragments. "Can't keep doing this." From Isabella, urgent and pleading. "Not much longer." From Marcus, reassuring. "She suspects something." Isabella again, worried. "She doesn't know anything." Marcus, dismissive. They were wrong. I knew everything. The next morning, while Marcus was at his monthly golf game and Connor was at work, I made my move. Isabella had given me a spare key to their house months ago. For emergencies. Today qualified as an emergency. Their home was a modern suburb colonial, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, lacking the character and history of the Whitaker estate. I knew I had approximately 3 hours before Isabella returned from her shift at the hospital. What I found in her home office made my blood run cold. Isabella hadn't just stumbled into an affair with my husband. She had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a military campaign. Spread across her desk were copies of our family's financial documents, property records, and insurance policies. She had researched Marcus's psychological profile, noting his vulnerabilities, his recent depression diagnosis, his concerns about aging, his guilt over not being more successful than his father. But it was the timeline that truly revealed the scope of her manipulation. 18 months ago, she had Googled wealthy families in our city and researched our family's background. 15 months ago, she had applied for a job at the hospital where Marcus received his cardiac care. 12 months ago, she had engineered a meeting with Connor at a charity event I'd organized. 10 months ago, she had married my son. 8 months ago, she had begun her seduction of my husband. Every milestone in their relationship had been calculated, from her accidental encounters with Marcus at the hospital to her gradual integration into our family dinners. She had even researched our family's trust, though her notes showed she didn't fully understand its protections. Most chilling was a handwritten note in her planner for next month. E needs to be out of picture before M files. Health issues, accident research, inheritance laws, if widow versus divorced. Isabella wasn't just planning to steal my husband and my home. She was considering having me killed. I photographed everything with trembling hands, then carefully returned each document to its original position. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a small leather journal tucked behind the other files. Opening it, I found what appeared to be a practice diary for Aunt Eleanor's care. Grace and Isabella's Aunt Eleanor had died 18 months ago of an apparent heart attack. According to Isabella's notes, she had been caring for Eleanor in her final weeks, managing her medications and monitoring her condition. The entries detailed Eleanor's symptoms, her medication schedule, and her growing confusion and weakness. What made my skin crawl was the clinical detachment in Isabella's writing. There was no grief, no emotional connection to a beloved aunt. Instead, the entries read like a medical experiment, documenting the effects of gradually increasing doses of Eleanor's heart medication. The final entry, dated 3 days before Eleanor's death, was the most damning, digitalis levels optimal, symptoms consistent with cardiac distress, will appear natural. Inheritance documentation complete. Isabella was a serial killer. Harold Morrison's law office was everything I expected from Marcus's longtime friend, Darkwood paneling, hunting prints, and an atmosphere of masculine privilege. Harold himself was a silver-haired man in his 60s who had known Marcus since their college fraternity days. "Evelyn," he said as we gathered in his conference room, his tone patronizing in the way men of his generation often used with women, "I want you to know that Marcus and I have worked very hard to make this as painless as possible for everyone involved." Marcus sat beside Harold, looking uncomfortable but determined. I took the chair across from them, playing the role of the confused, overwhelmed wife perfectly. "Before we begin," Harold continued, "I want to ensure you understand that this is intended to be an amicable dissolution. Marcus has been very generous in his proposals." I nodded graciously. "Of course! That's what we both want." Harold slid a thick folder across the table to me. "As you'll see, we've attempted to divide the marital assets equitably, taking into consideration the length of the marriage and both parties' contributions." I opened the folder and began reading, my expression neutral, even as the words on the page made my blood boil. According to Harold's proposal, I would receive the small downtown condo we'd purchased as an investment property 15 years ago, along with half of our joint savings account and a modest monthly alimony payment. Marcus would retain the family home, the business, the vacation properties, and the majority of our investment portfolio. "This seems rather one-sided," I said mildly, not looking up from the documents. Harold cleared his throat. "I understand your concern, Evelyn, but we have to consider the reality of the situation. Marcus has been the primary breadwinner throughout the marriage, and the business requires continuity of leadership. The house has significant maintenance costs that would be difficult for you to manage on a reduced income. Translation, they thought I was too old, too dependent, too naive to fight for what was rightfully mine. Additionally," Harold continued, his tone becoming more condescending, "there are some complications regarding the house specifically. It appears there may be some irregularities with the original deed and trust documentation. Until those issues are resolved, it would be prudent to leave the property in Marcus's name to avoid any legal complications." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. They were trying to steal my family's house using fabricated legal complications. "I see," I said quietly. "And these irregularities, when do you expect them to be resolved?" Harold waved his hand dismissively. "These things can take years to sort out. Generational property transfers, trust modifications, it's quite complex. Really, it's better for everyone if we keep things simple." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he'd used to explain complex business deals to me over the years. "Evelyn, I know this isn't easy, but Harold knows what he's talking about. This way, you won't have to worry about property taxes, maintenance, all those headaches. The condo will be perfect for you, much more manageable." Manageable, as if I were a child who needed to be protected from adult responsibilities. "Well," I said, closing the folder with a soft snap, "I suppose you've thought of everything." Harold smiled, probably thinking he'd won. "We've tried to be thorough. Of course, you're welcome to have your own attorney review the documents, but I think you'll find everything is quite standard for a case like this." A case like this, a devoted wife of 42 years, being discarded so her husband could play house with their son's wife. "That won't be necessary, though," I said, reaching for the pen Harold offered. "Where do I sign?" The room went silent. Even Marcus looked surprised by my immediate capitulation. He'd expected a battle, had probably prepared arguments and justifications for why he deserved everything. My compliance was making him nervous. "Are you sure? Evelyn?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Maybe you should take some time to think about it." I turned to my husband, this man I'd loved for 4 decades, and smiled. "Marcus, sometimes in life you have to know when to fight and when to accept reality. We've had a good run, but it's time for both of us to start new chapters." I signed my name with steady strokes, each letter precisely formed. Evelyn Margaret Whitaker, the same signature I'd used on our marriage certificate 42 years ago, back when I'd believed in forever. "There," I said, setting down the pen and looking directly at Marcus. "I hope this gives you everything you're looking for." 63 days after I'd signed those divorce papers in Harold's office, the call came. I was having coffee on my back porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine amusement as I answered. "Hello, Marcus. What the hell have you done?" His voice was raw with panic and rage, all pretense of civility abandoned. I took a leisurely sip of my coffee before responding. "Good morning to you, too. I'm fine. Thank you for asking. The weather is lovely today." "Don't play games with me. Evelyn, my lawyer called an hour ago. He says there's a problem with the house. Something about a trust that no one mentioned before." "Oh, that." I kept my voice light, conversational. "Yes. I imagine that came as quite a surprise." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then his voice came back, lower and more dangerous than before. "You knew. You knew about this trust the whole time, didn't you?" "Of course I knew, Marcus. It's my family's trust. My great-grandfather established it to protect our property from exactly this kind of situation." "This kind of situation?" His voice cracked with indignation. "We're getting divorced, Evelyn." "That's normal. People get divorced every day." I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the garden that my grandmother had planted, that my mother had tended, that I had lovingly maintained for 40 years. "You're right, Marcus. People do get divorced every day, but they usually don't commit adultery with their daughter-in-law while planning to steal their wife's family home." The sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't expected such direct confrontation. For weeks, I'd played the role of the confused, hurt wife. Now he was hearing from the woman who'd been planning his downfall while he celebrated his cleverness. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Long enough," I replied. "Long enough to document everything. Long enough to protect what matters. Long enough to watch you and Isabella plan your little future together in my family's house." "Our house," he corrected automatically, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "No, Marcus. Never our house. The deed has always been in trust. You were allowed to live here as my husband, but you never owned so much as a single brick. And now that you've chosen to end our marriage through adultery, you've forfeited any right to remain here." Another long silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like a man watching his world collapse, "Where am I supposed to go?" The pathetic quality of the question almost made me feel sorry for him. "Almost. I imagine you and Isabella will figure something out. You're both so clever. After all." "Evelyn, please. Can't we work something out? I know I made mistakes." "But mistakes." I cut him off, my voice sharp for the first time. "Mistakes are forgetting to pick up milk or missing an anniversary. What you did was a deliberate betrayal of everything we built together. What you did was seduce our son's wife and plan to steal my inheritance. Those aren't mistakes." "Marcus, that's who you chose to become." I heard a woman's voice in the background, shrill and demanding. Isabella, no doubt, wanting to know what was happening to her carefully laid plans. "I have to go," Marcus said, his voice defeated. "Yes," I replied calmly. You do. The call came 2 hours later, this time from Connor. My son's voice was shaky, broken in a way I'd never heard before. Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over? Of course. Sweetheart, are you all right? No, he said simply. I'm not. Connor arrived 30 minutes later, Grace beside him in the passenger seat. My son looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. She's been lying to me, he said without preamble as they sat down in my living room. All this time, Isabella's been lying to me about everything. Grace reached over and took his hand, her touch gentle and comforting. I told him, she said to me, I couldn't watch it happen anymore. I showed him where to look, what to search for. I found text messages, Connor continued, his voice raw with pain. Hundreds of them between Isabella and Dad. They've been planning this whole thing for months. The divorce, the affair they thought they were so clever, waiting until after you signed the papers to run off together. He pulled out his phone and showed me screenshot after screenshot of messages between Isabella and Marcus. The excitement, the planning, the cruel laughter at the expense of the people they were betraying. In one particularly vicious exchange, Isabella had written, "The old woman actually thinks she's getting half of everything. She has no idea what's coming. By Christmas, we'll be living in that beautiful house, and she'll be in some sad little apartment wondering what happened." Marcus had responded, "Just a few more weeks, baby. Then we can stop pretending to care about their feelings." "Where is Isabella now?" I asked. "I confronted her this morning," Connor said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Showed her the messages I'd found. She didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged and said I was naive if I thought she'd ever actually loved me. Said Dad could give her things I never could." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. To dismiss years of marriage, to mock the love of a good man who'd done nothing but cherish her, it was beyond comprehension. "I threw her out," Connor continued, his voice gaining strength. "Told her she had an hour to pack her things and get out of our house. She laughed at me. Mom said it didn't matter because soon she'd be living somewhere much nicer anyway." Somewhere much nicer, my family home, which she believed would soon be hers. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said, finally allowing myself to reach over and touch his shoulder. "You didn't deserve any of this." Connor looked up at me then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "How are you so calm about this Dad betrayed you too? He threw away 42 years of marriage for her." I studied my son's face, this man I'd raised to believe in goodness and loyalty, and made a decision. He deserved to know that he wasn't alone in this, that someone else was fighting for what was right. "Connor, there's something I need to tell you about the divorce, about what really happened in that lawyer's office." Over the next hour, I told him everything about Grace's warning, about my weeks of careful observation, about Victoria Sterling and the trust provisions that Marcus and Isabella knew nothing about. Connor listened in stunned silence as I explained how I deliberately played the role of the naive, defeated wife while gathering evidence and preparing my real response. "You knew," he whispered when I finished. "All this time, you knew what they were doing." "I knew," I confirmed. "And I let them think they'd won, because sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponents reveal exactly who they are before you make your move." Connor stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Mom, I had no idea you were so strategic." I smiled sadly. 42 years of marriage teaches you a lot about people, sweetheart, including when to fight and when to wait for the right moment. Grace had been quiet during our conversation, but now she spoke up. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "Something I probably should have told you weeks ago." Connor squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Go ahead." "Isabella isn't just manipulative and greedy," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's dangerous. This isn't the first time she's done something like this." Grace's hands shook as she opened the manila folder she'd brought with her. "Our Aunt Eleanor died 18 months ago. Sudden heart attack, very unexpected. Isabella was taking care of her at the time, helping with her medications. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud." Connor's grip on Grace's hand tightened. "The doctor said it could happen to anyone," Grace continued. "Eleanor had a heart condition, and sometimes these things just happen, but afterward, Isabella inherited Eleanor's house and her savings, and she seemed so pleased about it. Not grief-stricken like you'd expect, but satisfied." She pulled out a stack of documents. "Last week, when Connor started questioning everything, I went through Isabella's things that she'd left at our parents' house. I found these hidden in an old shoebox." The first document was a copy of Eleanor's original will, showing that she'd initially left everything to Grace and Isabella equally, but attached to it was an amended version, dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, leaving everything to Isabella alone. The second document was even more disturbing, a detailed medication log in Isabella's handwriting, tracking Eleanor's heart medication doses with clinical precision. The doses had been steadily increased over the final month of Eleanor's life, far beyond what any doctor would prescribe. "I think she killed Eleanor," Grace whispered. "I think she's been planning this kind of thing for years, targeting wealthy older people and then—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The pattern was clear. Identify vulnerable targets, gain their trust, manipulate their finances, then eliminate them and inherit their wealth. "We have to go to the police," Connor said immediately. "I already have," Grace replied. "I called Detective Robert Hayes this morning. He specializes in financial crimes and suspicious deaths. He's agreed to meet with us this afternoon." I looked at the documents spread across my coffee table, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the November air, the woman I'd welcomed into my family, whom I'd treated like a daughter, had been planning not just my financial ruin, but potentially my death. "There's more," Grace said, pulling out a printed email. "This is from a private investigator Isabella hired to look into your family's assets. She's been researching the trust for months, trying to find loopholes." The investigator's report was thorough and chilling. It detailed not just the trust provisions, but my daily routines, my medical history, my relationships with neighbors and friends. Isabella had been studying me like a predator studies prey, looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit. But the most terrifying part was a handwritten note attached to the report. "Subject has no close relatives other than son. Isolated lifestyle makes intervention difficult to detect. Recommend gradual approach using existing medical conditions. Heart medication interaction most promising avenue." Isabella had been planning to murder me using the same method she'd used on Eleanor. Detective Robert Hayes was a tall, lean man in his early 50s with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. He met us at the police station that afternoon, along with a forensic accountant and a specialist in elder abuse cases. "Mrs. Whitaker," Detective Hayes said after we'd presented all our evidence, "I want you to understand that what you're describing is a very serious matter. If your suspicions are correct, we're looking at multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and potentially murder." "I understand," I replied. "But I also want you to understand that this woman is still out there, and she's not going to stop just because her current plan fell through." Detective Hayes nodded grimly. "We're going to need to exhume Eleanor Chen's body for a proper autopsy. The original death certificate listed natural causes, but given what you've shown me, we need to take another look." The forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Lisa Park, had been studying Isabella's financial records. The pattern here is consistent with what we call Black Widow syndrome, she explained. The perpetrator identifies wealthy targets, insinuates themselves into their lives, then systematically drains their assets before eliminating them. How many victims are we talking about? Connor asked. Based on the financial records we've obtained, possibly 3 others in different states over the past 5 years, Detective Hayes replied. We're coordinating with law enforcement in Oregon and Nevada to investigate similar suspicious deaths. The scope of Isabella's crimes was staggering. She wasn't just a woman who'd made some bad choices. She was a calculating serial killer who'd been perfecting her methods for years. What about Marcus? Grace asked. Is he involved in the murders? Detective Hayes shook his head. From what we can determine, your husband was simply another victim of Isabella's manipulation. A useful idiot, if you'll pardon the expression. She needed someone with access to your family's finances and social circle. Marcus provided that access without understanding the full scope of her plans. It was a small comfort, knowing that the man I'd loved for 42 years was a fool rather than a murderer. But it didn't excuse his betrayal or lessen the pain he'd caused. We're going to need you to wear a wire, Detective Hayes said to me. If Isabella tries to contact you directly, we need to record any admissions or threats she might make. 3 days later, the wire proved its worth. Isabella called my home phone, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Evelyn, we need to talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss, dear, I replied, my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Oh, but we do. You see, I know you think you're very clever with your little trust fund surprise, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm dealing with a woman who seduced my husband and tried to steal my home, I said. What else is there to know? Isabella's laugh was cold and dangerous. You really are naive, aren't you? Do you think this was just about Marcus? Do you think I cared about some pathetic old man's midlife crisis? Then what was it about money, Evelyn? Real money. Your family's trust is worth $15 million. Your life insurance policies are worth another $2 million. And you, dear, are a lonely old woman with a heart condition who could have a very unfortunate accident at any time. My blood ran cold as she continued. I've been planning your death for months. I had the digitalis ready. The same thing I used on dear Aunt Eleanor. A little extra dose in your evening tea. And everyone would assume your heart finally gave out. Poor Marcus would inherit everything. And then, well, grieving widowers are so vulnerable, aren't they? You killed Eleanor, I said, stating it as fact rather than a question. Eleanor was practice, Isabella replied casually. A test run to perfect the method. She was so trusting, so grateful for my help with her medications. She never suspected a thing until it was too late. And you were planning to kill me the same way? Still am, actually. Just because the trust complicates things doesn't mean I'm giving up. There are other ways to arrange accidents, other methods that are harder to trace. You can't hide in that big house forever. Evelyn? The threat was clear and direct. Isabella wasn't just admitting to past murders. She was promising future ones. The police are listening to this conversation, I said quietly. There was a long pause. Then Isabella's voice came back, even colder than before. Prove it. And even if they are, I'll be long gone before they can find me. I've been planning exit strategies since this whole thing started. The line went dead. Within an hour, Detective Hayes had obtained arrest warrants for Isabella Chen on charges of murder, attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. But when police arrived at the address she'd given Connor, they found the apartment empty, except for a note on the kitchen counter. The game isn't over yet. Give my regards to your mother. Isabella had vanished. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the reach of modern law enforcement. The FBI became involved due to the interstate nature of her crimes, and within 72 hours, they'd tracked her to a small airport in Mexico,
where she was attempting to board a private plane using forged documents. The arrest was swift and final. Isabella fought like a cornered animal, screaming threats and accusations even as the handcuffs clicked into place. She tried to claim that Marcus had coerced her, that she was just another victim of an abusive older man, but the recorded phone conversation, combined with the evidence we'd gathered, made her protestations sound pathetic rather than convincing. Marcus, meanwhile, had cooperated fully with the investigation once he understood the scope of Isabella's crimes. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal, 5 years probation and community service, in exchange for his testimony against Isabella. He would lose his business, his reputation, and his freedom. But he would avoid prison. The trial lasted 6 weeks and made national headlines. "Black widow nurse kills for inheritance," screamed the tabloids. The prosecution painted a devastating picture of Isabella's calculated murders, her manipulation of vulnerable victims, and her complete lack of remorse. The defense tried to argue that Isabella was mentally ill, that her traumatic childhood had driven her to desperate acts. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the planning too meticulous. This wasn't the work of someone who'd snapped under pressure. This was the methodical behavior of a predator who'd found a profitable hunting strategy. Eleanor's exhumed body showed lethal levels of digitalis, far beyond what could be explained by her prescribed medications. Similar evidence was found in Oregon and Nevada, where Isabella's previous patients had died under suspicious circumstances. On a cold February morning, Isabella Chen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Eleanor Chen, with additional consecutive sentences for fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. As the judge read the verdict, Isabella's mask finally slipped completely. The charming, manipulative woman who'd fooled so many people was revealed as what she truly was, a remorseless killer who saw other human beings as nothing more than sources of profit. Spring came early that year, and with it, a wedding in the Whitaker family garden. Connor and Grace had decided not to wait for the traditional year of mourning after divorce. Life, they said, was too short and too precious to waste on arbitrary conventions. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family members who'd supported us through the darkest months of our lives. Victoria Sterling was there, having become not just my lawyer, but a genuine friend. Detective Hayes attended as well, bringing his wife and daughters to celebrate the victory of good over evil. Marcus was notably absent. He'd asked Connor's permission to attend, but my son had gently declined. "Some wounds," he explained, "needed more time to heal. Perhaps someday there would be room for forgiveness, but not yet." As I watched Connor and Grace exchange vows under the rose arbor that had witnessed 3 generations of Whitaker weddings, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the story was over, there would be grandchildren eventually, new challenges and joys to face, but because I finally understood who I was beyond being Marcus's wife or Connor's mother. I was Evelyn Whitaker, keeper of my family's legacy, protector of what mattered, survivor of betrayal, and architect of my own future. Grace looked radiant in my grandmother's wedding dress, which had been carefully preserved in tissue paper for 60 years. As she spoke her vows, I saw in her everything that Isabella had pretended to be genuine love, loyalty, and a deep respect for family traditions. "I promise to honor not just you," Grace said to Connor, "but the family that raised you, the values you represent, and the legacy we'll build together." When they kissed as husband and wife, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden, but these were tears of joy, of hope, of new beginnings built on a foundation of truth rather than deception. At the reception, Connor pulled me aside for a private moment. "Mom, I need you to know something. Grace and I have been talking, and we want our children to grow up in this house, the way I did. We want them to understand their heritage, to be part of something bigger than themselves."
I smiled, feeling the weight of 4 generations of Whitaker women settling peacefully on my shoulders. This house has always been about family, sweetheart. It's never been about the building itself, but about the love and values that fill it. Your children will be the 5th generation to call this place home. And they'll have the strongest great-grandmother in the world to teach them about courage and resilience, Grace added, joining our conversation with tears in her eyes. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I found myself standing in the same spot where Grace had first told me about Marcus and Isabella's affair almost a year ago. The rose garden looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Marcus was gone, facing the consequences of his choices in a small apartment across town. Isabella was in prison. Her killing spree finally ended, but Connor and Grace were building a marriage based on honesty and mutual respect. The Whitaker legacy would continue, stronger than ever. 6 months after the wedding, I stood in the downtown condo that had once been meant as my consolation prize in an unfair divorce settlement. Now, it served a very different purpose: the Whitaker Foundation for Women in Transition, a refuge for women rebuilding their lives after difficult divorces. The foundation offered temporary housing, legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support for women who found themselves alone and vulnerable after the end of their marriages. It was funded entirely by the Whitaker Family Trust, which, it turned out, had grown far beyond what any of us had imagined over the decades. Our first resident was Maria Santos, a 58-year-old woman whose husband had left her for a younger woman after 34 years of marriage. She'd lost her home, her savings, and her confidence, but she was determined to rebuild her life. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said to me one afternoon as we tended the small herb garden we'd planted behind the building. "I don't know how to thank you for this place. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning." "That's exactly how it should feel," I replied, remembering my own journey from devastation to empowerment. Sometimes the best chapters of our lives start when we think the book is ending. Connor and Grace visited every Sunday for dinner at the main house, continuing a tradition that stretched back generations. Grace was pregnant now, carrying the next Whitaker heir, and she glowed with the special radiance of a woman who was deeply loved and completely secure in her future. They'd decided to name the baby Eleanor if it was a girl, in honor of Grace's aunt, whose death had ultimately led to Isabella's downfall. It seemed fitting that Eleanor's legacy would live on in a child born into love and raised with the values that Isabella had tried so hard to destroy. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Grace asked me a question that I'd been expecting for months. "Evelyn, do you ever regret how things turned out? Do you ever wish you'd just confronted Marcus directly instead of playing the long game?" I considered the question carefully, looking out over the garden that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow over the years. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted. "But then I remember that if I'd confronted Marcus immediately, we never would have discovered what Isabella really was. She would have moved on to another victim, another family. Other people would have died." "So you saved lives by waiting," Connor added. "We all saved lives," I corrected. "Grace saved lives by finding the courage to speak the truth. You saved lives by believing her and acting on that information. Detective Hayes and his team saved lives by taking our evidence seriously and pursuing justice." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. At 65, I was discovering that some of life's greatest gifts come in the second act, when you finally understand what you're worth and refuse to accept anything less. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure that had weathered many storms and would weather many more. I thought about my great-grandmother, who'd raised 7 children in this house during the Reconstruction era. I thought about my grandmother, who'd maintained it during the Great Depression when money was scarce, but love was abundant. I thought about my mother, who'd kept it as a sanctuary during World War II when my father was overseas. I was part of a long line of strong women who'd protected what mattered, who'd faced adversity with grace and determination. Isabella had tried to break that chain, but she'd only succeeded in forging it stronger. Tomorrow, I would help Maria Santos prepare for her job interview at the local library. Next month, I would welcome a new resident to the foundation, a young mother escaping an abusive marriage. Next year, I would hold my first grandchild and tell them stories about their heritage, their family, and the importance of standing up for what's right. But tonight, I would simply be grateful for survival, for discovery, for the knowledge that at any age, at any stage of life, it's never too late to discover who you really are when everything false is stripped away. Outside my window, the November wind rustled through the bare branches of the oak tree Marcus and I had planted on our 10th anniversary. It had weathered storms, droughts, and countless seasons of change. Like me, it had bent, but not broken, had endured and grown stronger. In the spring, it would bloom again. And so would I. The Whitaker legacy lived on, not in the house or the money or the trust fund, but in the values that had been passed down through 4 generations of strong women. Honesty, courage, compassion, and the unshakable belief that family, whether born or chosen, was worth fighting for. Isabella had tried to destroy us, but she'd only made us stronger. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Thank you so much for staying with Evelyn's incredible journey until the very end. This story of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate triumph shows us that it's never too late to discover our inner strength and fight for what's rightfully ours. What did you think of Evelyn's strategic approach to dealing with her husband's betrayal? Were you surprised by Isabella's true nature as a serial killer? And how did you feel about the twist with the family trust that protected everything Evelyn held dear? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your reactions to the story. Tell me which twist shocked you the most. Or let me know if you've ever faced a similar situation of betrayal and how you handled it. Your stories and perspectives make this community so much richer. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and you enjoyed the journey from betrayal to justice, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel reach more people who love compelling stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. We share new tales of drama, revenge, justice, and human resilience every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Share this story with friends and family who love a good plot twist. I guarantee they'll be talking about Evelyn's brilliant strategy for days. And finally, comment below with the city or country you're watching from, so I can see how far Evelyn's story has traveled around the world. It's amazing to connect with listeners from everywhere who appreciate these powerful tales of justice and redemption. Thank you again for being part of our storytelling community. Until next time, remember, sometimes the quietest people are planning the loudest victories. See you in the next story.